My name is Alina, and at 68 years old I thought I understood the depths of loneliness that widowhood could bring. I was wrong. The deepest isolation came not from losing my husband of 42 years, but from discovering that my own daughter was systematically erasing me from the life we had once shared as a family. When Robert passed away 14 months ago, I believed that my relationship with my daughter Jessica would grow stronger. We had always been close, or so I thought. She had been Daddy's girl growing up, but she and I had shared countless conversations about everything from career decisions to relationship struggles. I imagined that in my grief, she would become my closest confidant, my link to the family Robert and I had built together. For the first few months after the funeral, Jessica did seem more attentive. She called regularly, stopped by with groceries, helped me sort through Robert's belongings. I was grateful for her presence during those dark early days when every room in our house seemed to echo with his absence. She listened to my stories about her father, helped me navigate the bewildering world of insurance claims and estate paperwork, and assured me that I would never face this new reality alone. But as the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in Jessica's behavior toward me. The phone calls became less frequent and more perfunctory. Her visits felt rushed, as if she was checking items off a duty list rather than spending time with someone she genuinely cared about. When I suggested activities we might do together, she often had scheduling conflicts or prior commitments that hadn't existed before. At first, I attributed these changes to her busy life. Jessica was 38 years old, married to a successful architect named Mark, and mother to two active children, 10-year-old Sophie and 7-year-old Daniel. She worked part-time as a graphic designer and seemed to have a full social calendar of school events, neighborhood gatherings, and professional obligations. I told myself that her reduced attention was natural and temporary, that once she adjusted to having a widowed mother, our relationship would return to its previous warmth. I was determined to be understanding and patient. I didn't want to be the needy, demanding mother-in-law who couldn't accept that her adult daughter had her own life to live, so I waited for her calls instead of initiating them. I accepted her rushed visits without complaint. I smiled and nodded when she explained why she couldn't stay longer or visit more often, but the pattern of exclusion began to extend beyond just time and attention. I started noticing that Jessica would mention family events and gatherings in passing, as if I had already been informed about them, when in fact she had never told me they were happening at all. The first incident occurred about 6 months after Robert's death. Jessica mentioned during one of her brief visits that Sophie had performed beautifully in her school's spring concert the previous weekend. I was confused because I had been looking forward to attending that concert, having marked it on my calendar after Jessica mentioned it weeks earlier. "Oh," I said, trying to hide my hurt and confusion, "I thought the concert was next weekend. I must have written it down wrong." Jessica barely looked up from the mail she was sorting on my kitchen table. "No, Mom, it was last Saturday. I'm surprised you forgot. You seemed so excited about it when I told you the date." But I knew I hadn't forgotten. I had that date circled on my calendar in red ink, and I had been planning what to wear and thinking about bringing flowers for Sophie. I had even mentioned the concert to my neighbor Mrs. Williams, telling her how proud I was that my granddaughter was getting a solo. I went back to my calendar after Jessica left, staring at the red circle around the wrong date. Had I really made such a fundamental mistake? Was my grief affecting my memory more than I realized? The doubt crept in like cold water, making me question my own perceptions and capabilities. The second incident happened a month later. Jessica casually mentioned that Daniel had won his Little League championship game and that the whole family had gone out for pizza afterward to celebrate. Again, I had known about the game and had planned to attend, but apparently I had been given the wrong date or time. "I waited at the field for over an hour," I told Jessica when she mentioned the celebration. "The field was completely empty. I thought maybe the game had been cancelled." Jessica frowned as if trying to remember. "Oh, that's right. They changed the time at the last minute because of the weather forecast. I thought I had called to let you know, but things were so hectic that day. I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing." Her apology seemed genuine, and I wanted to believe that these were simply miscommunications in a busy family schedule. But a nagging feeling in my chest told me that something more deliberate was happening. The pattern continued over the following months. Birthday parties I wasn't informed about until afterward. Family dinners I learned about through casual mention of leftovers. Holiday celebrations that had apparently been rescheduled without my knowledge. Each time, Jessica had a reasonable explanation. Miscommunication, last-minute changes, assumption that someone else had informed me. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Was I becoming the confused, forgetful elderly mother that every family dreaded dealing with? Was Jessica protecting me from embarrassment by not pointing out how often I was getting details wrong? The self-doubt was almost worse than the exclusion itself, but I wasn't losing my mind. I was being systematically isolated by my own daughter, though it took me months to accept this painful truth. The realization began to crystallize during a conversation with my longtime friend Patricia. We were having coffee at her kitchen table, a weekly tradition we had maintained for over 15 years, when she mentioned seeing Jessica and her family at the new Italian restaurant downtown the previous evening. They looked like they were having such a wonderful time, Patricia said, stirring sugar into her coffee. It looked like some kind of celebration. Jessica was so dressed up and the children seemed so excited. Was it someone's birthday? I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't known Jessica and her family were going out for dinner. I hadn't been invited or even informed. And from Patricia's description, it sounded like a special occasion, not just a spontaneous family meal. I'm not sure, I said carefully, not wanting to admit to Patricia that I had been left out of whatever they were celebrating. Jessica mentioned they might go out sometime this week. But as soon as I got home, I called Jessica to ask about the dinner. I tried to keep my tone casual and curious rather than accusatory. Oh, that, Jessica said when I mentioned seeing them at the restaurant. Mark got a promotion at work, so we decided to celebrate as a family. It was very last minute. We didn't want to bother you on such short notice. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but it stung deeply. Mark's promotion was significant news, the kind of family milestone that I would have wanted to celebrate with them. The idea that my presence would be a bother rather than a welcome addition to their celebration felt like a slap in the face. That night, I sat in Robert's old chair and forced myself to confront the pattern I had been trying to ignore. Jessica wasn't making innocent mistakes about dates and times. She wasn't simply forgetting to include me in family plans. She was deliberately excluding me from her life and using confusion and miscommunication as cover for her true intentions. But why? What had I done to deserve this treatment from the daughter I loved more than my own life? I replayed our recent interactions, searching for signs of conflict or resentment that I might have missed. Had I been too needy during my grief? Too dependent on her attention and support? Had I somehow become a burden she felt obligated to manage rather than a mother she wanted to include? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jessica's exclusion of me had begun even before Robert's death. During his final illness, when he was in and out of the hospital for treatments and procedures, Jessica had often seemed more focused on managing the logistics of his care than on providing emotional support to either of us. She had taken charge of communications with doctors and insurance companies, which I had appreciated at the time. But she had also begun making decisions about his treatment and care without consulting me, sometimes presenting me with arrangements that had already been finalized. When I tried to assert my role as Robert's wife and primary caregiver, Jessica would remind me how overwhelmed I was, how complicated the medical system had become, how much easier it would be for everyone if she handled the details. Looking back, I could see that she had been training me to step aside, to accept a diminished role in decisions that affected my own life. She had been teaching me to be grateful for whatever involvement she chose to allow me, rather than expecting to be a full participant in my own family. The pattern had simply continued after Robert's death, extending from medical decisions to social ones. Jessica had appointed herself the gatekeeper of family information and family gatherings, deciding when my presence was welcome and when it might be inconvenient or inappropriate. The cruel irony was that she was using my grief as justification for this exclusion. She would tell people, I later learned, that I was still adjusting to widowhood, that social situations were overwhelming for me, that she was protecting me from stress and confusion. She had created a narrative in which my isolation was a kindness rather than a cruelty. But I wasn't fragile or confused or overwhelmed by social interaction. I was lonely and grieving and desperate for connection with the family that represented my primary link to the life Robert and I had built together. Jessica's exclusion was making my grief worse, not better, by adding rejection and isolation to the loss I was already struggling to process. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November, almost exactly 1 year after Robert's death. I had been feeling particularly lonely that week, missing Robert intensely as the anniversary of his passing approached. I had been hoping to spend time with Jessica and the children, perhaps taking them to dinner or having them over to my house for a home-cooked meal. I called Jessica around 6 o'clock, hoping to catch her during the family's dinner preparation time when she might be receptive to making plans for the weekend. "Hi, sweetheart," I said when she answered the phone. "I was wondering if you and the family might like to come over for Sunday dinner this week. I could make that roast chicken the children love, and maybe we could look through some photo albums together." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the sounds of a busy household in the background. Children's voices, television noise, the clatter of dishes. "Oh, Mom," Jessica said, and I could hear a note of impatience in her voice that she was trying to suppress. "This weekend is really complicated. We have so many things going on. What kind of things? I asked, hoping she might mention activities I could join or help with. Just family stuff, she said vaguely. Mark's parents are in town and we have some commitments with them. Maybe next weekend would be better. I felt disappointed but not surprised. Jessica's in-laws had always taken priority when it came to family time, especially since Robert's death. Mark's parents lived several hours away and visited infrequently, so their trips always became major family events that seemed to absorb all of Jessica's available time and attention. Of course, I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. I understand that you want to spend time with them while they're visiting. Maybe I could meet them if that would be appropriate. I know your mother-in-law, and I got along well at your wedding. Mom, I really don't think that would work, Jessica said quickly. They're only here for a short time and we have very specific plans. It wouldn't really be appropriate to change the dynamic now. The phrase change the dynamic struck me as particularly cold. I wasn't asking to intrude on intimate family time. I was asking to be acknowledged as part of the extended family that included Mark's parents. The fact that my presence would change the dynamic suggested that I was viewed as an outsider whose inclusion would somehow diminish or complicate the visit. I understand, I said, though I didn't really understand at all. Well, maybe you could call me next week when things settle down and we can make plans for the following weekend. Sure, Mom, Jessica said, but I could tell she was already mentally moving on to other tasks. I need to go help Mark with dinner. I'll talk to you soon. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling more isolated than I had since the immediate aftermath of Robert's death. I understood that Jessica had obligations to her husband's family, but the complete dismissal of my desire to spend time with my own grandchildren felt unnecessarily harsh. But what happened next was so much worse than simple dismissal. The following Saturday evening, my neighbor Mrs. Williams knocked on my door around 7 o'clock. She was holding a small casserole dish and wearing the kind of concerned expression that immediately made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Eleanor," she said, "I brought you some of that tuna noodle casserole you liked last time. I thought you might enjoy having something homemade for dinner." I thanked her for the casserole and invited her in for tea, grateful for the company and the excuse to use my good china. Mrs. Williams had been a wonderful neighbor since Robert's death, checking on me regularly and including me in small social gatherings with other women from our block. As we sat at my kitchen table sharing tea and catching up on neighborhood news, Mrs. Williams mentioned something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "I saw your daughter and her family at the community center this afternoon," she said casually. "They were setting up for what looked like a lovely party. Jessica was directing the decorations and the children were so excited. It must be nice to have such a big family celebration." I set down my teacup carefully, afraid that my shaking hands might betray the shock I was feeling. "A party?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level and curious rather than devastated. "Oh yes," Mrs. Williams continued, apparently unaware of the bomb she had just dropped. "There were so many people helping with the setup, it looked like it was going to be quite an event. Jessica looked beautiful in that blue dress she was wearing, and Mark's parents were there too, directing some of the younger people who were hanging streamers." My mind was racing as I tried to process this information. Jessica had told me that Mark's parents were visiting and that the family had commitments that prevented us from getting together, but she hadn't mentioned a party at the community center. She hadn't mentioned a large family celebration that apparently required significant planning and setup. "Did you happen to see what the occasion was?" I asked, hoping Mrs. Williams might have overheard some detail that would help me understand what I was being excluded from. "I'm not sure," she said, "but from the decorations it looked like some kind of anniversary or milestone celebration. There were a lot of elegant touches and someone had arranged for catering. It looked like the kind of event you plan well in advance." An anniversary? My heart sank as I realized what Mrs. Williams had witnessed. November 15th was Robert and my 42nd wedding anniversary. If we had lived, we would have been celebrating that milestone this very weekend. But of course, I was celebrating it alone while my daughter threw a party I wasn't invited to attend. No, that wasn't right. Jessica wouldn't throw a party to commemorate my wedding anniversary without including me. That would be unthinkably cruel, even for someone who had been excluding me from family events for months. But then I realized what the party must actually be for, and the truth was somehow even more painful than my first assumption. Mark and Jessica would be celebrating their 15th wedding anniversary in 2 weeks. They had been married on November 28, 1993, in a beautiful ceremony that Robert and I had helped plan and pay for. It had been one of the happiest days of our lives, watching our daughter marry a man who clearly adored her and would provide her with the stable, loving partnership that every parent wants for their child. Jessica was throwing an anniversary party for herself and Mark, and she was celebrating it during the same weekend as my own wedding anniversary, without any acknowledgement of that fact and without any invitation for me to participate. I managed to get through the rest of Mrs. Williams's visit without revealing the depth of my shock and hurt. I asked appropriate questions about the neighborhood gossip she shared, complimented her casserole, and walked her to the door with expressions of gratitude for her thoughtfulness. But as soon as she left, I collapsed into Robert's chair and allowed myself to feel the full impact of what I had learned. My daughter was celebrating her marriage during the anniversary weekend of mine, and I wasn't welcome to join the celebration. The milestone that had once been the most important date on our family calendar had become so irrelevant in Jessica's mind that she could schedule her own party during the same weekend without even considering the conflict. Worse, she had lied to me about the reason for her unavailability. She hadn't mentioned the party at all, instead making vague references to commitments with Mark's parents. She had let me believe that I was being excluded simply because of scheduling conflicts, when in reality I was being excluded from a major family celebration that she had planned weeks or months in advance. The depth of the deception was breathtaking. This wasn't a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate choice to erase me from an important family event, combined with an elaborate lie to cover up the exclusion. I sat in that chair for hours, cycling through anger, hurt, confusion, and something approaching despair. How had my relationship with my daughter deteriorated to this point without my realizing it? How had I become someone whose feelings mattered so little that she could exclude me from major celebrations without even feeling the need to explain why? But most importantly, how was I going to respond to this betrayal? I could confront Jessica directly, demanding an explanation for her deception and her exclusion. But I suspected that approach would only result in more lies, more excuses, and probably an escalation of the conflict that would give her justification for even more severe exclusion from family activities. I could accept the situation and try to rebuild our relationship gradually, hoping that patience and understanding would eventually restore the closeness we had once shared. But months of being systematically excluded had shown me that Jessica's behavior was getting worse, not better, and that my patience was being interpreted as weakness rather than love. Or I could take a different approach entirely. I spent the weekend thinking about my options, and by Monday morning, I had made a decision that would have surprised the daughter who thought she could manipulate and exclude me without consequences. I was going to attend Jessica's anniversary party, whether I was invited or not. But I wasn't going to crash the event or create a scene that would embarrass my grandchildren or give Jessica ammunition to use against me later. I was going to attend as a guest, with a proper invitation, and I was going to make sure that my presence was not only welcome but necessary. You see, what Jessica didn't know, what she had never bothered to learn despite all her interference in my affairs over the past year, was that I had maintained significant connections to the community center where she was holding her party. I had been volunteering there for over a decade, serving on the board of directors for the past 5 years, and managing the facility's event planning and catering coordination for the past 3 years. In fact, I had been instrumental in the recent renovations that had made the community center one of the most popular venues for private events in our area. My suggestions had guided the kitchen upgrades, the lighting improvements, and the audiovisual equipment installations that made the space so appealing for celebrations like the one Jessica was planning. More importantly, I had established relationships with all of the vendors and service providers that people used when they booked events at the center. The florists, the caterers, the musicians, the photographers, most of them were small business owners I had worked with for years to coordinate events for other families in our community. Jessica had booked her party through the center's regular reservation system, but she had no idea that her mother was the person who managed vendor relationships and event coordination. She had probably assumed that the center's staff would handle all the details, without realizing that I would be consulted about every aspect of her celebration. On Monday morning, I drove to the community center for my regular volunteer shift, and I reviewed the weekend's event bookings with Patricia Chen, the center's part-time event coordinator. Patricia was a lovely woman in her 30s who had been grateful for my mentorship, as she learned the complexities of managing multiple events and vendor relationships. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson," Patricia said as we reviewed the weekend schedule, "I wanted to ask you about the anniversary party on Saturday. The family seems lovely, but they've made some vendor choices that I'm concerned about." I looked at the booking details for Jessica's party, feeling a mixture of sadness and vindication as I saw how much thought and planning had gone into an event I was supposed to know nothing about. "What kinds of concerns?" I asked Patricia, trying to keep my voice professionally neutral. "Well, they've hired Morrison Catering for the food service, and you know how unreliable they've been lately. And they've chosen that new photographer who gave us such trouble at the Williams wedding last month. I'm worried they're going to have problems that could reflect poorly on the center." Patricia was right to be concerned. Morrison Catering had been struggling with staffing issues for months, and their food quality had become inconsistent. The photographer she mentioned had arrived late to his last event, missed key moments during the ceremony, and been generally unprofessional in his interactions with guests. As the center's volunteer coordinator for vendor relationships, I had been planning to recommend that we stop referring clients to both of these service providers. But I hadn't yet had a chance to update our preferred vendor list or notify families who had already made bookings with them. "You're absolutely right to be concerned," I told Patricia. "Let me reach out to the family and see if we can help them make some adjustments to ensure their event goes smoothly." This was the perfect opportunity to insert myself into Jessica's party planning in a completely legitimate and helpful way. I wasn't crashing her party or forcing my way into an event I wasn't welcome at. I was fulfilling my volunteer responsibilities to ensure that events at our community center met our standards for quality and professionalism. I called Jessica that afternoon, introducing myself in my official capacity as the center's vendor relations coordinator. "Hello, this is Alina Patterson from the Westfield Community Center," I said when Jessica answered the phone. "I'm calling about your anniversary celebration scheduled for this Saturday. We've had some concerns about a couple of your vendor selections, and I wanted to offer some assistance in making sure your event goes perfectly." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Jessica's mind working as she processed the fact that her mother was calling her about her secret party. "Mom," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, dear," I said, maintaining my professional tone. "I volunteer at the community center, managing vendor relationships and event coordination. I had no idea you were planning a celebration there until I reviewed this week's bookings during my regular shift." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear voices in the background and the sound of Jessica moving to a more private location. "Mom, I can explain," she began, but I interrupted her gently. "There's nothing to explain right now," I said. "I'm calling in my professional capacity to let you know that Morrison Catering has been having some reliability issues lately, and the photographer you've chosen has been problematic at recent events. I'd like to help you make some alternative arrangements so that your celebration goes beautifully." You work at the community center?" Jessica asked, as if this was the most surprising part of our conversation. "I've been volunteering there for over 10 years, I said. "I serve on the board of directors and coordinate vendor relationships. I'm actually the person who recommended most of the renovations that made the space so appealing for private events." I could hear Jessica breathing on the other end of the line, but she didn't speak. "So," I continued, "shall we schedule a time to review your vendor arrangements and make sure everything is perfect for your anniversary celebration?" What followed was the most awkward conversation I had ever had with my daughter. Jessica was clearly struggling to process the fact that her mother had discovered her secret party through her own volunteer work, and that she was now in the position of needing my help to ensure the event was successful. She tried several times to explain why she hadn't mentioned the party to me, offering the same kinds of vague excuses about timing and family dynamics that she had been using for months to justify my exclusion from family events. But I didn't let her get bogged down in explanations or apologies. I maintained my professional demeanor and focused on the practical aspects of her event planning, as if I were dealing with any other family who needed assistance with their celebration. By the end of the conversation, we had scheduled a meeting for Wednesday afternoon to review her vendor contracts and make alternative arrangements where necessary. Jessica had reluctantly agreed to let me coordinate with the service providers to ensure everything went smoothly. She still hadn't invited me to attend the party as a guest. Wednesday's meeting was even more surreal than our phone conversation had been. Jessica arrived at the community center looking nervous and defensive, as if she were preparing for a confrontation rather than a planning session. I greeted her in the center's office, surrounded by vendor catalogs, event photos, and testimonial letters from families whose celebrations I had helped coordinate over the years. The visual evidence of my involvement in the community center's success was overwhelming, and I could see Jessica taking in details about my volunteer work that she had never bothered to learn. "I had no idea you were so involved here," she said as she looked at a photo of me receiving a volunteer service award from the mayor. "You never asked," I replied simply, and let that observation hang in the air between us. We spent an hour reviewing her vendor contracts and event timeline. I explained the problems we had experienced with Morrison Catering and the photographer she had chosen, and I provided recommendations for alternative service providers who could step in at short notice. Throughout the meeting, Jessica kept glancing at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. I think she was beginning to realize that her perception of me as a helpless, confused widow who needed to be managed and protected was completely at odds with the reality of who I actually was. Here I was, in my element, demonstrating expertise and competence and community connections that she had never imagined I possessed. I wasn't the woman who needed her to handle my affairs and make my decisions. I was the woman who was now handling her affairs and helping her make better decisions about her own celebration. The power dynamic between us had shifted completely, and I could see that Jessica was struggling to adjust to this new reality. By the end of the meeting, we had resolved all the vendor issues and created a detailed timeline for her event. I had contacted alternative caterers and photographers, negotiated better pricing for several services, and arranged for additional support staff to ensure everything ran smoothly. Jessica's anniversary party was going to be beautiful and perfectly coordinated, thanks to my intervention, and I still hadn't been invited to attend. As we were packing up the paperwork and preparing to leave, Jessica finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Mom," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, "about Saturday night. I know this whole situation is really awkward, and I want you to know that you're welcome to come to the party if you'd like." The invitation was grudging and uncomfortable, offered only because she now felt obligated rather than because she genuinely wanted me there. But it was an invitation nonetheless, and it gave me the opening I had been waiting for. "That's very kind of you to offer," I said, "but I already have plans for Saturday evening." Jessica looked surprised and perhaps a little relieved. "Oh," she said, "well, if your plans change, you're welcome to stop by." I smiled at my daughter, the same polite smile I would give to any community center client whose event I was helping to coordinate. "Actually," I said, "I'll be here anyway. I always work events on Saturday evenings to make sure everything goes smoothly and to handle any problems that might arise. I'll be in the building throughout your celebration, but I'll stay in the office area so I don't interfere with your party." The implications of this statement hit Jessica like a physical blow. I would be present for her anniversary party, but not as her mother or as a guest. I would be there as the community center volunteer who was ensuring that her event met our standards for excellence. I would be working while she celebrated, literally serving her needs from behind the scenes while remaining invisible to her guests. She would be celebrating her marriage in a facility that I had helped improve, with vendors that I had chosen for her, supported by services that I was coordinating, while I remained in the background like hired help. The parallel to how she had been treating me for the past year was unmistakable, and I could see from her expression that she understood exactly what I was communicating. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "that's not. I don't want you to have to work during our party. You should be able to enjoy the evening." "Oh, I'll enjoy it very much," I said sincerely. "There's nothing I like better than seeing families celebrate important milestones in our beautiful facility. And I always feel proud when events go perfectly because of the planning and coordination we've done behind the scenes." I gathered my purse and the vendor files, preparing to leave Jessica sitting alone in the office where she had just discovered that her mother was far more competent and connected than she had ever imagined. "I'll see you Saturday evening," I said pleasantly. "I'll be here early to coordinate with the caterers and make sure everything is set up perfectly for your celebration." Saturday evening arrived with the crisp, clear weather that November sometimes provides as a gift for outdoor photographers and indoor celebrations alike. I arrived at the community center at 4 o'clock, 2 hours before Jessica's party was scheduled to begin, to oversee the final preparations and coordinate with the vendors. The replacement caterer I had recommended was already setting up in the kitchen, preparing elegant hors d'oeuvres and arranging serving stations with military precision. The photographer I had suggested was testing lighting and angles, capturing beautiful shots of the decorated space before guests arrived. The florist was adding final touches to centerpieces that complemented the venue's architectural features perfectly. Everything was going to be absolutely perfect because I had made sure it would be. At 5:30, Jessica and Mark arrived to review the setup and prepare for their guests. Jessica looked stunning in a navy blue dress that I remembered helping her choose for another occasion years earlier. Mark looked handsome and proud, clearly delighted with the elegant celebration his wife had planned. I watched them from the office window as they walked through the party space, examining details and expressing satisfaction with the arrangements. They had no idea that every beautiful detail had been coordinated by the mother and mother-in-law they had excluded from their celebration. At 6 o'clock, the guests began arriving. I recognized many of them. Mark's parents and siblings, Jessica's college friends, neighbors from their subdivision, couples they socialized with regularly. It was clearly a gathering of their closest family and friends, the people who mattered most in their lives. I was not among them. From my position in the office, I could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, and the appreciation of good food. The photographer I had recommended was capturing beautiful moments of joy and connection. The caterer I had selected was serving delicious food that guests were clearly enjoying. Everything was perfect, just as I had planned it to be. Around 7:30, there was a complication with the sound system during Mark's toast to his wife. I could hear the feedback and static from the office, and I knew that the technical issue needed to be resolved quickly before it disrupted the celebration. I slipped into the party space through the kitchen entrance, carrying the technical equipment I would need to fix the problem. Most of the guests were focused on Mark and Jessica at the front of the room, so my presence went largely unnoticed as I worked on the sound system. But as I adjusted the microphone and tested the speakers, I became aware that several people were watching me work. Mark's mother approached me as I finished resolving the technical issue. "Excuse me," she said politely, "are you with the catering staff? You've done such a beautiful job with everything tonight." Before I could respond, Jessica appeared at my side, her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or panic. "Actually," Jessica said, her voice strained, "this is my mother, Alina Patterson. She volunteers here at the community center." Mark's mother's expression shifted from polite appreciation to confusion, and then to something approaching horror as she processed this information. "Your mother," she repeated, looking between Jessica and me, "but I thought, didn't you say your mother couldn't make it tonight because she wasn't feeling well?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Jessica's mind racing as she tried to figure out how to explain why her mother was working as technical support at her anniversary party instead of celebrating as a guest. "There seems to have been some confusion," I said smoothly, saving Jessica from having to fabricate another lie in front of her in-laws. "I volunteer here regularly, and I always work events to make sure everything goes perfectly. I'm just happy that Jessica and Mark's celebration is going so beautifully." Mark's mother looked even more confused. "But surely you don't need to work during your own daughter's anniversary party. Can't someone else handle the technical issues?" "Oh, I don't mind at all," I said with genuine warmth. "There's nothing I enjoy more than making sure families have perfect celebrations. And I'm very good at what I do here." I could see other guests beginning to pay attention to our conversation, and I realized that Jessica was about to face some very uncomfortable questions about why her mother was working instead of celebrating at her anniversary party. Mark joined our small group, apparently sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. "Mom Patterson," he said, using the name he had called me since their engagement, "I had no idea you worked here. Jessica told me you couldn't make it tonight." The web of lies Jessica had constructed was unraveling in real time, in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to her. Her in-laws were discovering that she had lied about why I wasn't at the party, and they were witnessing the awkward reality that I was working as support staff at their celebration instead of being honored as family. "Well," I said, maintaining my pleasant tone, "I'm here and everything is working perfectly now. Please don't let me interrupt your celebration any further." I started to return to the office, but Mark's mother gently touched my arm. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "would you like to join us for dinner? There's certainly plenty of food, and it seems wrong for you to be working while the rest of us are celebrating." The invitation was kind and well-meaning, but it put Jessica in an impossible position. She couldn't decline her mother-in-law's invitation to include me without seeming cruel and ungrateful, but accepting it would mean acknowledging that she had deliberately excluded me from an event where I clearly belonged. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I really need to stay available in case there are any other technical issues. Besides, I've already eaten dinner. Please enjoy your celebration." Mark's mother looked at Jessica with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand that something was very wrong with this situation, but she didn't press the issue further. As the evening continued, I remained in the office, monitoring the event from a distance and handling the occasional vendor question or minor issue. But I could see through the window that my brief appearance had created ripples of conversation among the guests. People were asking Jessica about me, wondering why her mother was working instead of celebrating, questioning the story they had apparently been told about my absence. Jessica spent much of the evening managing these conversations, trying to explain away the contradictions without revealing the truth about how she had been treating me. Around 9 o'clock, as the formal dinner was winding down and guests were beginning to mingle more freely, Mark appeared in the office doorway. "Mom Patterson," he said, "could I speak with you for a minute?" I could see from his expression that Jessica had probably tried to explain the situation to him, but that he was still confused about the dynamics he had witnessed. "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from my desk. Mark closed the door behind him and sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of processing stress. "I need to understand what's going on here," he said directly. "Jessica told me that you couldn't come to the party because you had other commitments, but you've been here all evening working. My parents are asking questions that I can't answer, and I feel like I'm missing something important." I looked at my son-in-law, this man who had been part of our family for 15 years, who had always treated me with respect and affection, who clearly had no idea that his wife had been systematically excluding me from family activities for months. "Mark," I said gently, "what has Jessica told you about my involvement in family events since your father-in-law passed away?" He frowned, clearly thinking back over recent months. She said you've been struggling with your grief, that social situations have been overwhelming for you, that she's been trying to protect you from stress while you adjust to being widowed. I nodded, unsurprised by this explanation. It was the same narrative Jessica had been using to justify my exclusion from family gatherings, and it sounded reasonable and caring on the surface. And how many family events have I attended in the past 6 months? I asked. Mark's frown deepened as he considered this question. I'm not sure, maybe none. Jessica said you preferred to grieve privately, that you weren't ready for social activities yet. Mark, I said, I haven't been invited to any family events in the past 6 months. Not Sophie's school concert, not Daniel's championship game, not your promotion celebration, and not your anniversary party. I've been excluded from everything, not because I couldn't handle social situations, but because Jessica decided I shouldn't be included. I could see the shock and disbelief in his face as he processed this information. That can't be right, he said. Jessica wouldn't, she loves you, she's been worried about you constantly since Dad Patterson died. I'm sure she has been worried, I said, but not about my well-being. She's been worried about managing me, about controlling my involvement in your family's life, about making decisions about what I can and can't handle without consulting me about my own preferences. I pulled out a folder I had prepared, containing documentation of the pattern Jessica had established. Phone records showing the decreasing frequency of her calls, copies of school newsletters and community announcements for events I had never been told about, photos from social media showing family gatherings I had discovered only after they happened. Mark, I said, I want you to look at this information, and I want you to think about whether Jessica has been protecting me from stress, or whether she's been causing me additional stress by isolating me from the family I love. He spent several minutes reviewing the documentation, and I could see his understanding of the situation shifting as he recognized the pattern of exclusion. Oh my God, he said finally, I had no idea. Jessica told me you were overwhelmed, that you needed space, that including you in things would be too much pressure for you. Did you ever think to ask me directly what I needed or wanted? I asked. The question hit him like a physical blow because we both knew the answer. He had trusted Jessica to manage my relationship with their family, just as she had been training everyone to do. He had accepted her assessment of my capabilities and preferences without ever verifying it with me directly. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. I should have realized something was wrong. I should have insisted that we include you, regardless of what Jessica said about protecting you. Mark, I said, you're not responsible for Jessica's choices, but you are responsible for your own choices going forward. The question is, what kind of relationship do you want to have with me? And what are you willing to do to make sure that relationship is based on truth rather than on Jessica's management of information? We talked for another 20 minutes, during which Mark began to understand not just the scope of Jessica's deception, but the impact it had had on my emotional well-being during the most difficult period of my life. When he finally returned to the party, I could see him seeking out Jessica for what was clearly going to be a very serious conversation. Through the office window, I watched them move to a quiet corner of the room, where Mark's body language and facial expressions suggested he was asking some very pointed questions. The anniversary celebration continued around them, but I could see that the dynamic between Mark and Jessica had changed significantly. He was no longer the trusting husband who accepted his wife's explanations without question. He was someone who had discovered that his wife had been lying to him about something fundamental to their family relationships. Around 10 o'clock, as guests were beginning to leave and the cleanup process was starting, Jessica appeared in the office doorway. Her makeup was smudged and she looked like she had been crying. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk." Yes, I agreed, we do. She closed the door behind her and sat in the same chair Mark had occupied earlier, but her posture was defensive rather than confused. "Mark is furious with me," she said without preamble. "He says I've been lying to him about you, that I've been cruel and manipulative. He doesn't understand the whole situation." "What situation is that?" I asked calmly. "You've been different since Dad died," she said, her voice taking on the same frustrated tone she had used when trying to explain away her exclusion tactics. "You've been needy and dependent and old in a way you never were before. I was trying to protect you from situations that might be overwhelming or embarrassing." I listened to this explanation with the same professional detachment I would use with any client who was trying to justify inappropriate behavior. "Jessica," I said when she finished, "can you give me a specific example of a situation where I was needy, dependent, or embarrassing?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again as she realized she couldn't provide a concrete example of the behavior she was describing. "You've been fragile," she said finally. "After Dad died, you seemed so lost and confused. I was afraid that putting you in social situations would make you more upset, that seeing other families celebrating would remind you of what you had lost. So you decided to protect me by making sure I lost even more," I said. You decided that the best way to help me cope with Robert's death was to exclude me from the family relationships that represented my primary connection to the life we had built together. That's not what I was trying to do, Jessica protested. But that's what you did, I replied. And more importantly, you never asked me what I wanted or needed. You never consulted me about whether I felt ready for social activities. You made decisions about my life without my input, and then you lied to cover up what you were doing. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the party space where workers were now cleaning up the remnants of her beautiful celebration. Jessica, I said, I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not a confused, fragile old woman who needs to be managed and protected. I am a competent adult who is grieving the loss of her life partner, but who is perfectly capable of making decisions about her own social and emotional needs. I turned back to face her, and I could see that she was struggling to reconcile the version of me she had created in her mind with the reality of the woman who had just coordinated her anniversary party behind the scenes. The fact that you've been excluding me from family events isn't protecting me, I continued. It's punishing me, and the fact that you've been lying to Mark and others about why I'm not participating in family activities isn't protecting my reputation. It's damaging it. Jessica was crying openly now, but I wasn't sure whether her tears were motivated by genuine remorse or by the consequences she was facing for her behavior. I don't know how to fix this, she said through her tears. Mark barely spoke to me for the rest of the evening. His parents are asking questions I can't answer, and you orchestrated this whole thing to expose me in front of everyone who matters to us. I didn't orchestrate anything, I said firmly. I provided vendor coordination services for an event at the community center where I volunteer. The fact that you chose to hold your anniversary party at a facility where I have significant involvement, without knowing about my role there, is not my fault. I sat back down across from her, and my voice softened slightly as I continued. Jessica, I love you more than you can possibly understand. You are my daughter, and nothing will ever change that. But I will not continue to accept being treated as if my feelings and preferences don't matter, as if my presence in your life is a burden to be managed rather than a gift to be treasured. What do you want from me? She asked. I want honesty, I said. I want to be included in family activities because you want me there, not because you feel obligated to invite me. I want you to stop making decisions about what I can and can't handle without consulting me. And I want you to stop lying to people about why I'm not participating in family events. And if I can't do those things, she asked, then we'll have a very different relationship than we've had in the past, I said. I won't chase after you or beg for inclusion. I won't accept exclusion and deception as the price of maintaining a relationship with my grandchildren. I'll build the life I want to have, with or without your participation in it. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Jessica began to acknowledge the extent of her exclusion tactics and the impact they had had on our relationship. She admitted that she had been uncomfortable with my grief, that she had found my emotional needs overwhelming, and that she had convinced herself that managing my involvement in family activities was easier than dealing with the messiness of my actual feelings. She also revealed fears I hadn't realized she was harboring, that I would become dependent on her family for emotional support, that her children would see me as a burden, that my grief would dominate family gatherings and make them uncomfortable for other people. These fears weren't entirely unreasonable, but her response to them had been completely inappropriate. Instead of talking to me about her concerns or setting reasonable boundaries, she had simply excluded me from family life and lied to cover up her exclusion. By the time we finished talking, the community center was empty except for us and the cleaning crew. Jessica's beautiful anniversary party was over, but the real work of rebuilding our relationship was just beginning. Over the following weeks, the consequences of that evening rippled through our family in ways that I don't think Jessica had anticipated. Mark's parents, who had witnessed the awkward revelation of my exclusion from the party, began reaching out to me directly, expressing concern about how I was being treated and inviting me to activities that didn't involve Jessica's permission or coordination. Mark himself started calling me regularly, something he had never done before, to check on my well-being and include me in family decisions that Jessica had previously managed alone. He began insisting that I be invited to family activities, and he started questioning Jessica's explanations when she tried to exclude me from events. Most importantly, my grandchildren began to understand that their mother had been keeping them away from their grandmother, and they started asserting their own desire to spend time with me. Sophie, who was 10 and old enough to understand family dynamics, began asking pointed questions about why she saw me so rarely, and why her mother always seemed to have excuses for why we couldn't get together. Jessica found herself having to defend exclusion tactics that looked increasingly indefensible when examined by people who cared about my well-being. She could no longer simply declare that I was overwhelmed or not ready for social activities when everyone could see that I was competent, engaged, and eager for family connection. The narrative she had constructed about protecting a fragile, confused widow collapsed completely when confronted with evidence of my actual capabilities and community involvement. 3 months after the anniversary party, Jessica requested a formal meeting to discuss our relationship going forward. She came to my house on a Saturday afternoon, bringing photo albums and a written letter that she read aloud to me. In that letter, she acknowledged the full extent of her exclusion tactics and took responsibility for the pain she had caused me during the most difficult period of my life. She admitted that her behavior had been motivated more by her own discomfort with my grief than by any genuine concern for my well-being. Most importantly, she committed to specific changes in how she would include me in family activities going forward. She would extend invitations directly to me, rather than making decisions about my participation without consulting me. She would be honest with other people about my capabilities and preferences, rather than constructing narratives to justify my absence from family events. The letter was a good start, but I made it clear that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, not just words and promises. "Jessica," I said after she finished reading, "I appreciate your acknowledgement of what happened, and I'm willing to work on rebuilding our relationship. But you need to understand that my trust in you has been fundamentally damaged. You spent months lying to me and about me, excluding me from family activities during the most painful period of my life. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal overnight." Over the following year, Jessica did follow through on her commitments. She began including me in family activities, inviting me to birthday parties and school events and holiday celebrations. She stopped making excuses for my absence and started encouraging my participation in family decisions. But our relationship never fully returned to what it had been before Robert's death. There was now a wariness in our interactions, a recognition that trust once broken could be repaired but never fully restored to its original condition. I also discovered something important about myself during that year of rebuilding. I didn't need Jessica's approval or inclusion to have a meaningful life. The community connections I had built through my volunteer work, the friendships I had maintained despite her exclusion tactics, and the new relationships I developed with my grandchildren independent of her management. All of these proved that I was capable of creating the life I wanted to have, with or without her participation. On the second anniversary of Robert's death, I organized a memorial celebration at the community center where Jessica had held her anniversary party. I invited family and friends to share memories and stories about Robert's life, and I used the event to launch a scholarship fund in his name for students pursuing careers in engineering, his chosen profession. Jessica attended that memorial celebration, along with Mark and the children, but she was no longer the gatekeeper of my family relationships or the manager of my social activities. She was simply one participant among many in a celebration that I had planned and executed myself. As I stood in the same room where I had once worked behind the scenes to make her anniversary party perfect, I realized how completely our dynamic had changed. I was no longer the excluded mother begging for inclusion in family activities. I was the host of my own event, surrounded by people who valued my presence and appreciated my contributions to their lives. The evening was beautiful and meaningful, exactly as I had planned it to be. Robert would have been proud not just of the memorial itself, but of the strength and independence I had demonstrated in creating it. After the guests left and the cleaning was done, Jessica approached me in the same office where we had confronted the truth about our relationship 18 months earlier. "Mom," she said, "I wanted to thank you for including us tonight. The memorial was beautiful, and I know Dad would have loved the scholarship idea." "You're welcome," I said. "I'm glad you could be here. I also wanted to say," she continued, "that I understand now why you were so hurt by what I did. Seeing you tonight, organizing something this meaningful and bringing together so many people who care about you, I realize I was completely wrong about who you are and what you're capable of." I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised and loved and nearly lost to her own fears and misunderstandings. "Jessica," I said, "I hope you've learned that excluding people from your life doesn't protect them. It just makes you smaller. And I hope you've learned that underestimating people, especially people who love you, is one of the most damaging things you can do to a relationship." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I have learned that, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." As we walked out of the community center together that night, I reflected on the journey we had both taken since that devastating anniversary party, where I had been forced to work behind the scenes at my own daughter's celebration. I had discovered that I was stronger and more resilient than anyone, including myself, had realized. I had learned that grief doesn't have to mean helplessness, that being vulnerable doesn't require accepting mistreatment, and that love without respect is not really love at all. Most importantly, I had proven that wisdom and experience are powerful tools for creating the life you want to have, even when others try to diminish your capabilities or exclude you from opportunities to demonstrate your worth. I was 68 years old and I was finally living exactly the life I chose to create for myself. If Alina's story resonated with you, you're in the right place. Here at Wisdom Strikes Back, we share stories of seniors who refuse to be underestimated and prove that experience is power. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you believe that wisdom and dignity deserve respect. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of your age? How did you handle it? Your stories inspire our community. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are never too old to stand up for yourself. Until next time, keep proving that wisdom strikes back.